Hello, it's good to be with you again for our adult Sunday school lesson. And this week we are picking up in Isaiah. So from here on out, through the remainder of this quarter and pretty much all of next quarter, we are going to be looking at books of the prophets. And if you recall a statement I made many months ago, I suppose, that we have been in the prophets since we started the transition from Deuteronomy to Joshua, because that is the way the Jewish compilation of scripture accords the book of Joshua. And many of the books that we would consider historical narrative, those are known as the former prophets. And then when we get to these books that actually bear the names of people to whom they are accredited to, as goes the primary speaking and writing prophet, those are known as the latter prophets. And of course, we have a tendency to kind of divide them a little bit more into the major prophets, or those prophets who actually have quite a bit to write: Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. And then, of course, the minor prophets, which basically means they wrote a little less. In some cases, a lot less. If you look at the one chapter or just sole work of Obadiah, that really doesn't even consist of a chapter, in the sense that no more are numbered after it. But all that to simply say that the Jewish compilation of scripture follows this acrostic known as Tanakh, Torah, Nevi'im, or prophets, and Ketuvim, and that's the writings and the books that we would consider such as the Psalms and the Proverbs and so forth. They would all fit neatly in that category. So we have been in the prophets for some time, technically, but in the way that we have a tendency to consider the prophets, we are just now transitioning into those books. And so our next 7 weeks or so are going to be spent looking at various works the prophets have written. And when we start next quarter, we'll be looking at a few more weeks in the prophets, and then we'll be transitioning into the post-exilic works of Ezra and Nehemiah to spend the rest of our time in the Old Testament. So this is the second and I think last treatment that we will get of Isaiah, considering just a few Sundays ago we were there in Isaiah chapter 44. So we're going to be looking at material from 3 chapters, 22, 25, and 30. And then we're going to be breaking this down by first going back to visit the material that connects to this from the beginning of Isaiah all the way up until 22. And you might think, well, that's a little daunting. And you would be right. It's very daunting that that is our task. And I know it's not necessarily our task for the Gospel Project curriculum, but I'm not really interested in following what the writers have to say as goes this lesson. I'm more interested in taking this opportunity to try to introduce more of the material of Isaiah to you, so that you can better understand how to study these particular chapters that we're going to be reading now and how this fits in. Because I'm sure many of you, as all of us at some point, have looked at the book of Isaiah and thought this is challenging. It's very difficult. 66 chapters, and it's hard to keep everything straight and where it's going if you're trying to map out a trajectory. So if I have the opportunity to share something with Isaiah, from Isaiah with you, I would prefer that that be our focus. Because again, in just a few months, we're going to be transitioning to the New Testament, and we're going to be spending 18 months in the New Testament before we finally circle back to Genesis again around fall of 2024. So with all that time, and this being the only chance that we'll get to really focus in somewhat microscopically on Isaiah, I want to utilize this for all that I can. So having said that, let's jump on in and read in Isaiah 22, verses 8 through 14, and you see the rest of the passages listed on the screen. So he, being the Lord, removed the defenses of Judah, and on that day you looked to the weapons in the house of the forest. You saw that there were many breaches in the wall of the city of David. You collected water from the lower pool. You counted the wall or the houses of Jerusalem so that you could tear them down to fortify the wall. You made a reservoir between the walls for the water of the ancient pool, but you did not look to the one who made it, that being the rock that the entire city is built upon. If you consider that Jerusalem is something of a raised plateau on one side, or the one who created it long ago. On that day, the Lord of armies called for weeping, for wailing, for shaven heads, and for the wearing of sackcloth. But look, joy, gladness, butchering of cattle, slaughtering of sheep and goats, eating of meat and drinking of wine. Let's eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. The Lord of armies has directly revealed to me, this iniquity will not be wiped out for you people as long as you live. The Lord God of armies has spoken. Now to chapter 25. Lord, you are my God. I will exalt you. I will praise your name, for you have accomplished wonders, plans formed long ago. Almost sounds like a psalm, does it not? And it is in many ways. But when you look back to what we just read a few chapters before this in the compilation of the scroll, it may seem somewhat disjointed, but we're going to address that. With perfect faithfulness, for you have turned the city into a pile of rocks, a fortified city into ruins. The fortress of barbarians is no longer a city. It will never be rebuilt. Therefore, a strong people will honor you. The cities of violent nations will fear you, for you have been a stronghold for the poor person, a stronghold for the needy in his distress, a refuge from storms and a shade from heat. When the breath of the violent is like a storm against a wall, like heat in a dry land, you will subdue the roar of barbarians. As the shade of a cloud cools the heat of the day, so he will silence the long song, he will silence the song of the violent. And lastly, 18 through 22. Therefore, the Lord is waiting to show you mercy and is rising up to show you compassion. For the Lord is a just God. All who wait patiently for him are happy. For people will live on Zion in Jerusalem. You will never weep again. He will show favor to you at the sound of your outcry. As soon as he hears, he will answer you. The Lord will give you meager bread and water during oppression, but your teacher will not hide any longer. Your eyes will see your teacher, and whenever you turn to the right or to the left, your ears will hear his command behind you. This is the way, walk in it. Then you will defile your silver-plated idols and your gold-plated images. You will throw them away like menstrual cloths and call them filth. If you'll join me now for a moment of prayer. Jesus, our King, thank you for another week that you have shepherded us through. Thank you for bringing us here to this time and for giving us the space in our week and the time to be able to listen to this and engage with it. Give us clear minds to think and hear with, and help us to truly pay attention with sincere and humble hearts ready to learn. Not simply because I prepared something, Lord, but because anytime that we come into your presence, anytime we have the chance to focus on your word, anytime we have the chance to hear something from you, our hearts need to be focused on that singular task and not toward the dozens of other things that clamor for our attention. Help us to be not distracted, but again, focused with clarity. And Lord, I ask that you please help us to understand what seems to be perhaps your favorite prophet to quote from, or at least the writers of the gospel accounts. And as Isaiah permeates more of the New Testament than any other author does, Lord, but yet this scroll is challenging. And with a little bit of time that we have here, Lord, I pray that you will help us to understand more of you, your plan and intent, your purpose. Help us to relate to this in a way that just doesn't merely cause us to see reflections of the New Testament within it, but of course, what this meant to the original audience that heard these words from your prophet. And of course, those who would go on to read it for generations and still read it to this day, even though, of course, they may not necessarily see it with the clarity that you provide, Lord Jesus, as you are Messiah, and yet their hearts are blinded to that, and they wait for someone else to fill that role. Enrich us, Lord, for your word is only you can, that you be glorified, and we be challenged and edified. In your name I pray. Amen. I will take this, though, from the author of our lesson that as the title for the Gospel Project lesson is A Humiliated Nation, I will say that much of what Isaiah is talking about is the humbling, first of all, Judah and the capital city of this kingdom, Jerusalem, but ultimately the nations. And we're going to walk through that a little bit. And we'll even see how this transitions to the cosmos and how it continues to converge on and circle back to this inevitable landing place that will culminate in the end of the Isaiah scroll. And what I mean by that is there are several places where we will visit a moment of hope, of a beautiful and bright future. And ultimately, that's what the last few chapters of Isaiah will end with, is a more drawn out and expanded view of what that means and an understanding of what we should be anticipating in Messiah if we were the original hearers of this message or readers of these words in the generations that followed up until centuries later, Messiah does come. And then when Jesus does come, the reality of who he is and what he does is obvious enough, but at the same time, it's incredibly challenging because much of what they anticipated from words that Isaiah spoke along with other prophets was molded. And I don't want to say twisted in the sense that it was perverted or corrupted, but twisted in the sense that you might think of a jeweler or maybe someone who is a fine metallurgist and craftsman, twisting small strands of metal into thin pieces of wire to make a beautiful piece of jewelry or whatever, just the manipulation of these words to try to craft a theology of who Messiah was. And yet Jesus shows up to challenge these things, these expectations of who he was and what he would do by turning much of that on its head and flipping that paradigm upside down and then showing them the reality of what the kingdom was. And for some, it's going to cause them to stumble and fall away, though they may have initially believed. Others to completely scoff at this as if this can't possibly be from the Lord, and others to believe it, yet somewhat question because they're just not sure how this can make sense with what they've been told before and trying to make that all reconcile. But then eventually, as the Lord continues to open their minds, as he's challenging them with truth to wrestle with, they do come to see it. And then some will even take pen to parchment themselves and write about it in the letters or the gospels that we have in the New Testament. All that to simply say, I want to take some time to just try to briefly summarize the major movements of this scroll, understanding that if you want a deeper dive into this, then I encourage you, I actually outright implore you to please join us, if you can, on Wednesday night, in which we will be diving into the Isaiah scroll. We've already went through the first 12 chapters in 4 weeks, but that doesn't mean you're too far gone or behind to understand what's coming now. And of course, because these lessons are archived on our YouTube page, maybe on Facebook as well, it's entirely possible for you to go back and listen to those. They're about an hour and a half a piece, as our Sunday school time is. So if you're used to listening to me here, then you'll be used to the length of time there. But that would give you a much more expanded view of what's going on in Isaiah. But all that aside, I'm going to take the time to try to drill this down and condense it down much more so that you can understand a lot of what's going on, but also realizing that there is so much more that cannot be said in this little bit of time that I have, that the Isaiah class will have a chance to give you more insight on, but of course, not all of what you need, because that would take years and lots of reading and studying. So I don't want to gild the lily anymore. I want to jump right into this. We're going to look, as you see here in this subtitle, Understanding the Flow of Isaiah leading into chapter 22. So that's my goal here, is to get us up to chapter 22 so that we can understand what Isaiah means instead of trying to take it apart from the perspective of Isaiah 22 and looking back to the things that Isaiah has already said, and then me trying to explain that along the way. So let's look into the first 12 chapters. And the reason why the first 12 chapters is because you see the opening verse here of chapter 1, the vision concerning Judah and Jerusalem that Isaiah, son of Amoz, saw during the reigns of these 4 kings. When you flip to chapter 13, you will see a very similar phrase. It's a prophecy or an oracle concerning Babylon that Isaiah, son of Amoz, saw, and that spans up chapter 13 and 14. But when we move over to chapter 15, we do not get a rehashing of that phrase, in which we see a vision or prophecy or oracle concerning Moab that Isaiah, son of Amoz, saw. That is not given to us every time we move to a new city or nation that Isaiah is speaking against. So what that tells us is that there is an internal feature to this scroll that compiles the messages that are chapters 1 through 12 into a grouping all to themselves, which does not mean that they are disjointed or disconnected from the major work of the scroll, and that it has nothing to do with what Isaiah will say after that. But there is a host of sub-themes that are embedded in the first 12 chapters that bring them very closely together, cohesively, in such a way that they're glued together. They work together in harmony in a way that perhaps doesn't work quite so well if you were to deconstruct chapters 1 through 12 and try to immerse them amongst the rest of what Isaiah will say in the subsequent 54 chapters. And then when we get to chapter 13 and we see the same phrase of a vision or whatever, but it's now focused against someone else besides Judah and Jerusalem, but here Babylon, that Isaiah, son of Amoz, saw. And then we get 10 chapters worth of many different oracles, some big, some small, concerning cities or entire nations that are all grouped together, but they do not go back to this phrase again and again and again to tell us that it's a new vision. They just go on as if to say the only thing that separates them is the little mention in a verse that now we've moved away from the preceding nation or city to this particular nation and city. And whatever Isaiah is going to say about it will be said, and then we move on. So it's a collection of oracles concerning these cities and these nations, all grouped together in 10 chapters. And there are other marks of this kind of internal division in the scroll of Isaiah. So a brief introduction to that, and just to simply say that that's the reason why we are focusing on these 12 chapters as a distinct grouping. And there are other features to this too, but I think that's enough to suffice for now. So what I want to point out is, as we continue on through chapter 1, what we are getting up front is this very woeful picture of what Judah in the eyes of the Lord looks like. And we know it's Judah, first of all, because it was mentioned to us. These visions have to deal with Judah and Jerusalem. But if you're vaguely familiar with the content of the first 12 chapters, Isaiah does actually break away momentarily at points and speak toward the northern kingdom of Israel. And he will use terms such as either Israel or Jacob, meaning the people of Israel, but it's distinct from Zion, because in some cases he will say Zion in the same oracle or passage in which he is speaking on a certain topic. And so with these two distinct groupings, Jacob must be referring then to the kingdom that was named after him. Or another term could be Ephraim or Samaria, which is the capital city at this time of this northern kingdom. So he does use both groups together, even though the opening statement to this first chapter is that these visions seemingly are exclusive to Judah and Jerusalem. That's not entirely accurate. But I will say that all of them being Israelites, and they are considered by the prophets to all be the people of God, even though they are in two separate kingdoms, could perhaps be one of the reasons why Isaiah is treating Israel in these oracles as well. But we get this woeful picture that daughter Zion, which is Jerusalem, is abandoned, like a shelter in a vineyard, a shack in a cucumber field, like a besieged city, which is not alone in the sense that there are people in it, but alone in the sense that no one is going to come out and help them. Oftentimes that's the kind of thing that happens with besieged cities, right? That the only rescue that is going to happen is going to come from anyone who is either in a treaty or of sorts with the nation or kingdom, I should say nation state or city state. I'll get it out in a second. The city state or kingdom that is besieged. And what I mean by that is instead of, a territory like the United States, in which from northern to southern borders, eastern to western coasts, that is our entire land, right? Not to mention the other sovereign territories out there in the oceans and whatnot. But all that to say that in this particular day and time, while Judah has defined borders and their capital city is Jerusalem, that sometimes these kingdoms are little more than just the city and the outlying fields that go on for several acres and miles beyond that, but may not have terribly distinct borders like you would see with a much larger kingdom, perhaps like Egypt or whatever the case might be. Nonetheless, if the Lord of armies had not left us a few survivors, we would be like Sodom, we would resemble Gomorrah, which, if you are familiar with the Old Testament narrative given to us in Genesis, then you know those cities were divinely overthrown, being judged by the Lord, decimated to the point where there was nothing left but ash from the fire and sulfurous stone rained down from heaven upon them. Now, it's interesting to say that Isaiah is giving this picture already that Jerusalem is abandoned like this and that a few survivors are left. So it sounds like the city has already been besieged and has fallen under the judgment of the Lord. And because of that, they have suffered some sort of terrible militaristic conflagration that has caused many people to be deported. And it immediately throws us into a bit of a tizzy because we're not really sure, trying to get our bearings, where is this happening in the span of these four kings that Isaiah says that he prophesied under, because Uzziah's time as king, for the most part, was peaceful. Jotham did see some attacks from the northern kingdoms of both Israel and Aram or Syria that, while enemies for quite some time of each other, they decided to create a pact because they felt that they would be a stronger force with each other against the rising threat of Assyria, and wanted Judah to join their little league, but Judah would not. And because of that, they were using fear tactics to intimidate, to try to get them to comply and join their confederation or coalition against Assyria, or they would come and conquer it. And by conquering it, they would just install their own king who would be their vassal or puppet and do what they wanted, so that they could use and expend Judah's resources in helping them to battle against Assyria. And of course, a part of this also is the divine judgment that God is bringing upon Judah and Jerusalem during the kingship of Ahaz, who amongst this spread of four kings is by and large, I would say, almost the only wicked king in the sense of that word, but by far the wickedest of these four kings. All that to simply say, this is another mark of the stylistic compilation of Isaiah's work, in the sense that the message that's being given to us up front here, even though it seems to fit much later in the kingship of, say, Ahaz or whatnot, in which Judah has been attacked, Jerusalem has come under siege perhaps, and by virtue of that, people have already been deported off as waves of captives, which will happen when the northern kingdoms of Israel and Aram come to attack them. All that to say, the picture is given to us very grimly to show how serious the situation is of Judah's sin and her apostasy, her adulterous and blasphemous, treasonous rebellion against the Lord in allowing idols to become more prominent in the land, and now even in the temple complex, spread out all through Jerusalem, which is characteristic of Ahaz's, I believe, 12-year reign, or maybe 20 years, one of two, as king. Nonetheless, it's a very dire picture, but when we end the chapter, we have reached a bright spot, because the Lord will say, as he concludes this chapter, that Zion will be redeemed by justice, those who repent by righteousness. At the same time, rebels and sinners will be broken, and those who abandon the Lord will perish. But nonetheless, the city, while it deserves every bit of God's wrath and justice, and of course, to be obliterated and to be carted off into exile, which is the proclamation that Isaiah is going to make toward the northern kingdom, that's not going to be given the chance for repentance. They are going to be cast off, and the Lord will allow Assyria to completely consume them and take them off into exile. And we're talking the majority of the nation of Israel, 10 whole tribes, are going to be removed from the land. But Judah will have the chance to linger on for more than a century before the Babylonians will come and do that very thing. So Zion will be redeemed at some point. So we don't end on this somber note. Instead, we go back up to something of a very bright note, which carries us over into the beginning of chapter 2, in which we are told here the vision that Isaiah, son of Amoz, saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. In the last days, the mountain of the Lord's house will be established at the top of the mountains and will be raised above the hills. All nations will stream to it. And so it's more than just simply being redeemed. Basically, Jerusalem becomes the epicenter of the world, the highest of worship sites, or most exalted, is the way that we should really be thinking of this, not a topographical change on the map in which now Jerusalem's mountain peak is going to be the highest mountain peak on the planet, as some pretend, but it will be the place in which all the world and humanity itself within it will, of course, stream. And we should be thinking rivers and Garden of Eden imagery here. People rivering up the mountain to come to the apex where the Lord is now physically dwelling, and he is going to teach all humanity and send forth his word from Jerusalem to the uttermost parts of the world as people river up and down the mountain to hear the word and carry it away with them. And this is not exclusive to just ethnic Israel. But then when we move further down in chapter 2, house of Jacob, come, let's walk in the Lord's light. You have abandoned your people, the house of Jacob, because they are full of divination from the east and fortune tellers like the Philistines, which of course these are things that Moses decries in the Torah as being evil and wicked in the Lord's sight and worthy of judgment. He says, for a day belonging to the Lord of armies, so what we would say is the day of the Lord, against all that is proud and lofty, against all that is lifted up. And he goes on to say, through many examples, what he is talking about, which is not exclusive to just Jacob, house of Israel, kingdom of Israel. He looks to the ships of Tarshish and many other places and peoples that Israel would be familiar with, but are also examples of those kingdoms who have become lofty, high and lifted up, filled with pride in their own right and mind. And of course, the Lord is going to make examples of them, as he is also lumping the house of Jacob or Israel and the kingdom of Judah into that mix as well, shaking them all up and then tearing them all down to scratch, and then working to rebuild all humanity through the redemption that is going to be forecast by Isaiah later on in the person of Messiah. So, in other words, we're moving from a low point, chapter 1, to a high point, and then we start chapter 2 at a high point, but now we move to a low point where we begin, messing up my own schematic here, where we begin chapter 3 down here. So we move to chapter 3. Note this, the Lord God of armies is about to remove from Jerusalem and from Judah every kind of security. That obviously is not reassuring. That is a tone of judgment that is meant to connote that in every possible way. So it's interesting and almost in some ways a little bit contradictory if we're thinking about it. I'm not trying to suggest there are contradictions. All I'm saying is that if we're stopping to embrace this for what it is, it would be natural, I think, for us to ask the question, Lord, are you going to make up your mind? What are you going to do? Are you going to judge Jerusalem, or are you going to redeem it? And the answer to that would be yes, he is going to do both. And he's not going to do both simultaneously. It's one followed by the next. But the way we would expect to see that presented to us would be the judgment phase followed by the redemption and restoration phase. And then we move on. But it continues to flip-flop. Now, it certainly doesn't give us the picture that the Lord is going to judge, then redeem, and then after this moment of redemption, judge again. He just keeps alternating back and forth between the picture of judgment, but the promise that redemption and restoration will come, but yet moving back to the picture of judgment that is still yet to occur, and promising that judgment will come, and it will be swift, it will be decisive, it will be complete, and it will be devastating. And he goes back to this to reassure them over and again that in spite of these glorious pictures of redemption, that God is not going to allow his anger to be assuaged in any of this until he has spent his fury and wrath on Jerusalem for what it is they have done in breaching the terms of the covenant, not once, not twice, but so many times no one could possibly keep count. So that is the entirety of chapter 3, which means that we're down here for much of this. But then when we get to chapter 4, which is incredibly short, just 6 verses, we make a huge surge out of the valley that we were in, almost the abyss, considering how dark the tone of chapter 3 is. On into chapter 4, we are told that on that day, the branch, notice this is capitalized because it is a messianic title, but the branch of the Lord will be beautiful and glorious. Whoever remains in Zion, whoever is left in Jerusalem will be called holy. So there, of course, is going to be few, but there will be indeed remnants of people who will be left here. They will all be called holy, all in Jerusalem, written in the book of life. There could be no greater picture of redemption if that is the case, because these are those who are preserved for life, to never have to worry about death again. Sorry, I've got something showing up on my screen here. All right. When the Lord has washed away the filth of the daughters of Zion and cleansed the blood guilt from the heart of Jerusalem. So the picture in chapter 1 is of a diseased body that is almost on the point or brink of collapse. And then, of course, with that, death. It's covered in boils and sores that are all open, not scabbed over wounds, but still festering and pouring out blood and pus and whatnot. And so, again, the compromise of the body is such that there's no possible way this thing can be healed. It is almost on the brink of collapse and then sheer death, which in the picture of what's going to come with the pronouncement of judgment upon Judah and Jerusalem is that this will lead to their exile, which of course is their death in Babylon. But subsequent to that will be their resurrection, which is what is pictured here in chapter 4, with them coming back to Jerusalem, the remnant that is left over. And with that, they will be the reverse picture of chapter 1, completely washed, cleaned, all those wounds not only simply dressed and medically attended to, but now the picture of life is such that all of that has been taken away from them as they have been fully restored, right? So that's chapter 4. And I didn't want to continue to go through this in chapters 5 and 6. I figured I'd cut a little bit of that out because it's more of the same. So if you're kind of getting the picture already, it's important for us to then just go ahead and move to chapter 7, because chapter 7 gives us a point of historic synchronization where it's very apparent to Ahaz, again, the wickedest of these 4 kings that Isaiah prophesies under, that Aram, again, the kingdom of Syria, and Israel are now in alliance with each other, and they're going to be coming to lay siege to Jerusalem, perhaps, or they're definitely going to be crossing over the borders, and they're going to be bringing military devastation to Judah. Now, they've already started doing that in the time of Jotham, Ahaz's father, probably just testing the defenses to an extent, but now this is going to be a full-on assault because Ahaz has learned that Aram has entered into the kingdom of Ephraim under peaceful premises. They are camping out in that kingdom and preparing for a much greater assault. So Ahaz is frantic. He is going to try to inspect their defenses, their water supply, which is the mention of the pool here, the upper pool by the road to the launderer's field in chapter 7. And this is what Isaiah is told to do, to go out with his son, Shear-Jashub, to meet Ahaz at the end of this junction of the upper pool in the launderer's field. And he says to him, calm down, be quiet, don't be afraid or cowardly because of these 2 smoldering sticks, the fierce anger of Rezin and Aram, the son of Remaliah. I'm sorry, Rezin and Aram, which Rezin is the king of Aram, and the son of Remaliah, parenthetically, that's Pekah. All that to simply say, when Isaiah brings his son, Shear-Jashub, that name is very important because it means a remnant will return or survive. So this was a sign act to Ahaz to assure him that no matter what happens in any of these military conflagrations, the Lord is promising by his own hand that indeed not all of Judah or Jerusalem will be extinguished in this, and that a remnant will survive. The Lord will allow a lamp to continue to flicker there in Judah or Jerusalem for a time, and eventually that too will be extinguished and carted off into exile, but even there it is not fully extinguished. The flame flickers until eventually it is brought back and restored. So that is supposed to be a measure of comfort, a soothing message to Ahaz that the Lord is with him. And then Isaiah even offers, as this is an invitation directly from the Lord to Ahaz to ask for any sign that he wants. From the highest of heavens to the lowest depths of the abyss, the Lord will grant him whatever he asks for to verify that indeed the Lord is with him. But Ahaz, of course, is far too interested in looking to other more what he considers to be sure alliances. And what he's actually doing is trying to play the enemies of his enemies against each other by allying with Assyria and paying heavy tribute to the Assyrian emperor to basically use him as a mercenary force. And in buying him, he will then be able to oust Israel and Aram out of his backyard, and he doesn't mind paying the heavy tribute and whatever is required of the Assyrian king of him to maintain that status quo. But it will, of course, exact a much heavier price than he ever possibly could have fathomed. All that to simply say that that is a promising note at the beginning of chapter 7 that the Lord is with them. He is not going to allow them to be extinguished. A remnant will survive, and any sign that Ahaz wants will verify this. But he doesn't want to ask because he's got his own plans in mind. And so by the time we get to the mid portion of chapter 7 to the end, this is what Isaiah says. Listen, you house of David, on that day when God brings Assyria against them, the Lord will use a razor hired from beyond the Euphrates River, which is indeed the very king that Ahaz wants to ally himself with, and hiring them. So he's using Ahaz's plans and putting them into words against him, saying that this razor is the king of Assyria, and he will shave the hair on your heads, the hair on your legs, even your beards, which is a huge sign of humiliation for men to suffer such a thing. You think of the story of David and his emissaries that he sent over the Jordan to the king of Ammon, and when his father had passed away, to shore up his friendship with this son who is now going to replace his father, who David was friends with. And he listens to his advisors, and when he does, his advisors convince him that David has come here to spy out your territory so that he can come and conquer it. So send a message, and that's what he does. He cuts off the garments of David's emissaries up to the level of their hips to expose their legs, which again is hugely shameful to them. And then he shaves half their beards off. And David will not even let them come home to be with their families. He makes them reside in Jericho until their beards grow back, so that way they won't have to come to Jerusalem and be laughed at, scoffed by the people because of what has happened. So all that to say, in chapter 7, we began on a high note, but we end on a low note, promising that not only is judgment coming against the kingdom of Israel, which in all the words that we're not reading here in chapter 7, that's what God is promising. We've alluded to it here in these two smoldering sticks, saying, if you think of the word picture, it's about to go out. God is going to extinguish these two kingdoms by using Assyria for that purpose. But it doesn't require Ahaz to act by entering into a treaty with the king of Assyria. But because he intends on doing that, God is going to use that against Ahaz and Judah. And he's going to use this king that Ahaz is hiring to bring punishment upon them as well. But it will be different. It will be somewhat tempered with mercy, because it will be to the complete decimation of the northern kingdom of Israel and Aram, but not to Judah. So hopefully you're following. This is building here for us to get to chapter 22. We're almost there. Chapter 8, we get more of this negative connotation with the Lord will certainly bring against them the mighty rushing water of the Euphrates River, the king of Assyria and all of his glory, running, if you think about it, let me get my whiteboard here. Here's it at. There it is. So the two rivers, that's the Euphrates, this is the Tigris, and Assyria is here. Judah is way down here, and of course, Israel is here with Aram here. And Assyria will have to cross over, and when they do, it will be like a river flowing over its banks and pouring down through this land, but it won't stop there in Aram or Israel. It will flow over here into the southern kingdom of Judah as well, which is what he's saying. The king of Assyria in all his glory, it will overflow its channels and spill over all its banks, and it will pour into Judah, flood over it, sweep through it, reaching up to the neck, and its flooded banks will fill your entire land. But he says, Emmanuel, God with us. Now, this comes after the initial Emmanuel prophecy in chapter 7, which again is the promise that a virgin conceiving will indeed give birth to a child, and his name shall be called Emmanuel, meaning God with us. God will be with us as part of the suffering that is announced there in the end of chapter 7 that is going to be brought on the house of David, bringing us into chapter 8, which is more of what he's expounding on as he talks about this sweeping tidal wave of an overflowing river that's pouring over the land of Israel, but will not stop there and come into Judah as well, bringing God's judgment. But thankfully, as we move beyond that into chapter 9 with the promise of a son who is going to be born, bringing light, a dawning of a new age to those who have been troubled and judged in the land of Naphtali and Zebulun, the northern tribes of Israel that have settled around the Sea of Galilee, that when that light dawns and brings in a new era, it's going to come with the birth of a child on whose shoulders the governments of the nations will rest. And his name will be myriad in that sense that he will be called Wonderful, Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. But then more of chapter 9 after that is filled with languishing against Judah and Jerusalem, more pronouncement of judgment. But then eventually we get to chapter 10, and with chapter 10, for a period, Isaiah breaks away from the speaking of judgment against Israel and Judah, and now he looks to Assyria, who is the key pivotal player in all of this, because he is God's river flowing over its banks, pouring into the land to bring judgment. He is the hammer that God is going to bring down. He is the rod and tool of this justice. But of course, Assyria, being like all the other nations that fill this little pocket of the world, is certainly lifted up in the vanity of her own pride, as she is the domineering power player here. And for the first time in human history, we're actually going to be looking at what will become an empire, because unlike any other nation before it, they will swallow up many nations and kingdoms and rule vast swaths of land beyond their own native territory. And with that, they are going to wreak devastation in a way the world has probably never seen before. And so, because of that, they are going to think themselves like a machine that's unstoppable, very mighty. And of course, they are the ones who are responsible for their own success and victory. So now Isaiah, guided by the Lord, is going to turn to Assyria and pronounce against them this woe, or this death sentence, if you will. To Assyria, the rod of my anger, the staff in their hands, which is my wrath, I will send him against a godless nation, which could be all of the kingdoms that Assyria has swallowed up, because they are all considered godless. But it's an insult to say this of Israel and Judah, because these are the peoples, the descendants of Abraham, that God covenanted with. And by virtue of that, walking in the wisdom and light of his counsel was their mandate so that they could reach the nations, but instead they have become like the godless nations. And this, of course, is the primary target that God is wielding Assyria against. He's going to send them against this godless nation to take spoils, to plunder. But this is not what they intended. Instead, having not planned just for this, they want to completely swallow up these nations. And they are going to lift themselves up saying, hey, are we not responsible for this? Are all these nations not like Calneh and Carchemish, or like Damascus and Samaria that I've already swallowed up? Basically, the Lord is saying, because of the vaunting of their own vanity and pride, therefore the Lord God of armies will inflict an emaciating disease on the well-fed of Assyria, kind of going back to the picture of Judah in Isaiah 1, and he will kindle a burning fire under its glory, which in chapter 5, with the song of the vineyard and the promise that God is going to burn this vineyard after letting it lay fallow and turn into a wasteland of sorts, that he is going to do the same thing to Assyria. So God is not sparing any judgment or justice for them, and they too will be consumed by the very fire they are wielding against these nations as God turns it on them. And then we get to chapter 11, which is one more hint at a messianic prophecy here of the stump of Jesse. If you think about it, it's just that. It's a tree stump that has been left because of the felling of the massive trunk and tree that was there, but a new shoot is going to grow off of it. And with that, new leaves. But notice this new shoot is going to grow from the stump of Jesse. So it's interesting here to say that it's coming from Jesse, because what this is not termed as is David. Now, of course, Messiah is going to come from the family line of David as a direct descendant, making him the heir to David's throne. And it's said that he will be seated on David's throne and rule from it, sure. But he is not said here in this particular oracle to be from the line of David. He is from the line of David's predecessor, this being Jesse. And interestingly enough, Isaiah is also going to go on and say that not only is this shoot coming off of Jesse, but it's the very root that feeds the line of Jesse, which is paradoxical in and of itself. But all that to say, if David was a shoot that led to the growing of this tree that was once there, but has now been cut down such that it is no more, it is just the stump, for another shoot to grow off the stump that is Jesse is to say that the Messiah will be another David. It's not enough to say that he is just simply from David. He will be another David altogether, not a resurrected David, another David. I hope you're catching on to that. And a branch from his roots will bear fruit. The Spirit of the Lord will rest on him. And on that day, the root of Jesse will stand as a banner for all the peoples. The nations will look to him for guidance. The NIV says to rally around him. So that means not only is he going to be gathering, as he goes on to say, the dispersed of of Israel, the scattered of Judah, which means these peoples, Israel and Judah, will be carted off into exile, but they will come back to Zion through a new exodus being forecast here. And Messiah is going to be not only the rallying point, but he will also go on to say, as he has in previous spots in Isaiah 1 through 12, that he is going to be the pillar of cloud and fire, leading them and resting over the summit of Jerusalem or Zion and remaining there to provide protection or a canopy over the entire summit itself, meaning that this is the rallying point for the end stage of this Exodus, in which these peoples, the descendants of Abraham, who have become this remnant that God is bringing back to the land, are going to be preserved there and, of course, tended to. But now this is stretching out far beyond just the descendants or boundaries of ethnic Israel from Abraham, but is going to all the nations, because he says he will be a banner for the peoples, as much as he will be a banner that is a rallying point for the remnant of Israel and Judah. And he will be the spirit bringer who brings life, because if you think of this term, spirit in Hebrew is ruach, and it's the very same word used in Genesis chapter 1 in the creation epic, in which God is pulling from chaos and the dark primordial waters that covered the earth, the dry landmass on which he will cover it with vegetation, create a terrarium for all the created land-dwelling animals and birds and whatnot to dwell upon and fly over, and then man to rule over it in that garden temple. So this shoot that's going to be a new David coming from the stump of Jesse is going to be the mode and means of new creation for the remnants of these peoples who are going to come flocking to him for life and preservation, which leads us into the very short chapter of 12, piggybacking on chapter 4. And on that day, the Lord himself, I should say, on that day you will say, it will be sung of him, the Lord himself, he is my strength and my song, he has become my salvation, which is the very words used by Moses and the Israelites on the banks of the Red Sea when God brought the river or the walls of water tumbling back down on the heads of the Egyptians and drowning the army and ending the threat that they posed against Israel, giving complete total victory to Israel, as now their deliverance is complete in that they will not have to fear Egypt any longer. God has assured their redemption and liberation. And it's only befitting as we draw this little segment of chapters 1 through 12 and its themes to a beautiful conclusory note, which is a very, very befitting song or psalm sung by those who will be brought back to the land and the nations who get to become now part of God's covenant people as a new Israel, singing about the redemption and the exodus that God has led them through to himself, in which now, like Israel at Sinai, they will be meeting the Lord at his new cosmic mountain, Zion. And I don't mean that in a full-on literal sense. I mean that more so in the figurative sense that we experience, as Paul was saying in his letter to the churches in Galatia, Zion, or the heavenly Jerusalem, everywhere we are. That is not a geographically bound place anymore. So that's a quick run through chapters 1 through 12. But that leads us up now to the corridor of chapters 13 through 23, which pivots away from this just a bit, but it continues it in a sense. And what I mean by that is, if you think about it, we've had chapters 1 through 12 focused pretty much on Judah, Jerusalem, but now we are opening this up to encompass all these other nations that dwell around them, because God is pronouncing the same message of judgment against all of them. But it also comes with a dualistic meaning or significance for Judah as well. And I'll explain that along the way. But it's as if to say, we've already had forecasted the redemption of all the nations, but as we had this picture that was constantly revolving back and forth between judgment, redemption, redemption, looking at the same moment of judgment, but from different angles and for different reasons, same moment of redemption, but different pictures of how that will come to pass and how it will look in the end. Now we're also seeing the same thing with respect to the nations, and that we're not flipping back and forth on the picture of judgment and restoration for any one particular nation, but the picture of judgment for this nation and judgment for that nation and judgment for this nation and judgment for that nation. But interspersed through here, there are going to be brief moments in which God is going to speak judgment, but then also speak of redemption, in which this nation is going to be joined with Israel to become part of the redeemed throng of God's people. So it's important for us to pay attention to that, because again, all this feeds up to chapter 22, which if you notice here, as I pointed out, we're looking at chapters 13 through 23. So 22 is right toward the very end of that. So let's take some time to explore this. But first, I want to pull right from the heart of this section in Isaiah 17, 12 through, it's not 12 through 12, it's 12 through 17. I'm sorry. Or maybe it's 12 through 14. Either way, this is taking a big step back away from the microscopic view of this nation or that nation, but it's speaking generally about, and very broadly, all the nations. When it says, the roar of many peoples, this term here, peoples, we could easily substitute in there nations. It's talking about everybody. I don't mean the whole world in the sense that Isaiah is speaking about those who are dwelling here on the North American and South American continents, whoever those peoples might have been. Those are not even part of the biblical purview at this point. Now, they do become that once we start talking about the gospel leaving Jerusalem and going to the uttermost parts of the earth. Those kinds of phrases. Hear this, you islands of the east, you coasts of the west. Those are the kind of phrases that speak toward the uttermost parts of the map, even the unknown regions that these prophets do not even know exist. Certainly not the peoples that are inhabiting those areas. But those are the kind of phrases that are speaking beyond just the geographic area of the Mesopotamian River Valley, northeastern Africa, as goes Egypt and Cush, Ethiopia and whatnot. And then, of course, the area of the Levant. And then southeastern Europe, and of course, the Eurasian corridor of what we would call now modern day Turkey and so forth. All of those areas are pretty much part of the biblical purview of the known world, okay, until it expands a little further westward toward Rome and then Spain or Tarshish. Anyway, so the roar of many peoples, they roar like the roaring of the seas, the raging of the nations. They rage like the rumbling of rushing water, kind of carrying us back to the picture of chaotic water in Genesis 1 that had to be calmed and tamed for the Lord to begin creation. The nations rage like the rage of a huge torrent, and he rebukes them. They flee far away, driven before the wind like chaff on the hills, like tumbleweeds before a gale. So it's a good synopsis, a good picture of what the Lord is working through in these previous sections of 13 up through this portion of 17. And then after that, 18 all the way up through 23. All right. So look, here in chapters 13 and 14, we have all of that material dedicated to one nation. Now, chapters 1 through 12 deal largely with Assyria, but there is a mention of Assyria in 13 through 23, so they're not being taken out of the mix. But now we're transitioning over to Babylon, because Babylon is on the horizon, as goes the aspiring superpower that will eventually throw off their Assyrian yoke and then become a challenger to them on the geopolitical stage. We see that play out in the life of Hezekiah. And then eventually, within a generation or two, they do become powerful enough to not only challenge Assyria, but then conquer them as Assyrian dominance begins to dwindle and they can gain the upper hand. So look, the day of the Lord is coming. We've already had a pronouncement of the day of the Lord in chapter 2. This is another day of the Lord, because that day of the Lord was speaking about the judgment God was going to be bringing upon particularly Judah, Jerusalem, right? This is pointed against someone else. So we should understand there is not one day of the Lord. There are many sequences, and a lot of them contained in the Isaiah scroll of the day of the Lord. Okay, so it's just a moment of finality, and I hope you're looking at the screen because I'm using air quotes, finality in the sense that it's bringing to an end a particular chapter of an era of this people that is a devastating, calamitous judgment, but it doesn't mean it's the end of the world, even though it may use that kind of picturesque language. Case in point, let's continue. The day of the Lord is coming, cruel with fury and burning anger, to make the earth a desolation. We reading this are already thinking, make the earth a desolation. That's the end of time. That's the last or the day of the Lord, if we're operating under the auspice that there's only one. To destroy its sinners. Indeed, the stars of the sky and its constellations will not give their light. The sun will be dark when it rises. The moon will not shine. I will punish the world for its evil and wicked people for their iniquities. I will put an end to the pride of the arrogant and humiliate the insolence of tyrants. I will make the heavens tremble. The earth will shake from its foundations at the wrath of the Lord of armies on the day of his burning anger. That phrase, burning anger, going back to the previous movements we've already looked at in chapters 5 and then 10 of the Lord burning up, first the vineyard he planted in Canaan, the people of Israel, and then, of course, the Assyrians, as if they were their own vineyard or forest in the terms that are given there in chapter 10. Now, this is going against these nations. Anyway, look, I'm stirring up the Medes against them. They will have no compassion on offspring. They will not look with pity on children. And Babylon, the jewel of the kingdoms, the glory of the pride of the Chaldeans, will be like Sodom and Gomorrah when God overthrew them. Remember, in chapter 1, Isaiah said, if the Lord had not left us few survivors, we would have been like Sodom and Gomorrah. So just recycling the imagery again to speak about the finality of judgment, but this is not a world-consuming judgment. He is not saying here the Lord is going to judge the world like he did Babylon. This is speaking exclusively about Babylon. And Jeremiah applies the same imagery in Jeremiah 4, where he is talking about on the day when the Lord came and brought judgment through the Babylonians against Judah. To him, when the next day came, he saw the world as if it was formless and void, using the very stylistic language of the beginning of Genesis chapter 1, before creation begins, when God is calling chaos to order, and then through that order, bringing about a world that can be inhabited by his creatures. That now the world was formless and void. The sun is not giving its light. It's as if the stars don't shine. He's using this very Asiatic language here to describe the devastation that Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians have wrought on his own people. But this is just Judah and Jerusalem being judged by the Babylonians. It's not the entire world being consumed. So a lot of this imagery is very figurative, as if to say the dignitaries, which in ancient Near Eastern language is often pictured as heavenly bodies, literally sun, moon, and stars, representing kings and nobles, that they won't shine. They have been deposed from their positions of power, conquered by these armies. And by virtue of that, because they don't shine, the illumination that was the guidance of these people is gone. Their nation doesn't exist anymore. They are beholden to a conquering force that now determines their fates. That's the kind of imagery this language is meant to invoke. Again, not an end of the world, all-consuming judgment. So all that to simply say, Babylon is the very first target of God's judgment and justice. Now we're working through the left side of the screen, which carries us up to chapter 17, and then we'll go to 18 and beyond. Hang with me. We're getting somewhere with this. I'm not going to expound on all of this. I just simply want to go through these to show you this is the pattern. So 14, we go back to Assyria. The Lord of armies has sworn, I will break Assyria in my land, and I will tread him down on my mountain. So we know their doom per chapter 10 and now 14, and then 21 is going to be pronounced, all right? Or I'm sorry, I think it's chapter 20, the next place that's pronounced. Chapter 14, in the year that King Ahaz died, this pronouncement came, wail, you gates, cry and tremble with fear, all Philistia. So, of course, this is another neighbor. Assyria, way off beyond on the other side of the Mesopotamian River Valley, but a looming threat that's pressing in on the Levant, or the area where Israel is settled at. So they, of course, are like neighbors in their backyard, but Philistia has always been a thorn in their side since the days of the judges. Chapter 15, a pronouncement concerning Moab. Moab are their neighbors directly to the east across from the Jordan. Moab is devastated, destroyed in a night. 17:1, a pronouncement concerning Damascus. Damascus is the capital city of the kingdom of Aram, which again are their neighbors as far as the land or kingdom of Israel is concerned, to the northeast. Damascus is no longer a city. It has become a ruined heap. Then we work through these verses that we've read up there in chapter 17, in a portion of the chapter, and on into 18. Woe to the land of buzzing insect wings beyond the rivers of Cush. So now we're going past the kingdom of Egypt, again, northeastern Africa, but it's the kingdom of Ethiopia, or what we might call Sudan in today's terms, geographically speaking. They will all be left for the birds of prey on the hills. So pictures of total devastation. Now moving a little northward to the kingdom of Egypt. Egypt's worthless idols will tremble before him, and Egypt will lose heart because the Lord will come against them like a rider on a swift cloud. But now, interestingly, at the end of chapter 19, a lot of territory or space narratively is dedicated to the pronouncement that when the day of restoration comes, the Lord is not only going to restore the fortunes of his people Israel, but he is going to be taking Egypt and Assyria and uniting them to his people. Israel will be called my people, Egypt my handiwork. And he's going to have altars built on the boundaries of Egypt and Assyria that mark these places, like the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, marking territory in Canaan as the Lord's, that this land is the Lord's. As they build altars to places where he appeared to them as, they are going to be building altars to the Lord in some of their more prominent cities and on their borders, where sacrifices are going to be offered up. A superhighway is going to join all three of these kingdoms together, because they are all going to be flooding into the land of Israel to come to honor the Lord. Now, again, all of this is figurative. We're not looking at this kind of thing happening in the future, because sacrifices are not going to be offered in the future, right? And the kingdom of Assyria doesn't even exist anymore, and it's not going to be carved out as a new kingdom, all for the sake of this prophecy to be fulfilled in that kind of hyper literal way. It's just to say that these peoples who are enemies of Israel, and Israel themselves being enemies of God through her apostasy, are all going to be redeemed. It's a picture of humanity coming together as a new people, a new Israel, to all worship God together. And these pronouncements of blessing are not simply for ethnic Israel. But then he goes back to the pictures of woe and doom and gloom when he says in chapter 21, a pronouncement concerning Duma. One calls to me from Seir. This word should be familiar to us because it is the capital of Edom. So Duma is another word for Edom. The morning has come, but also night behind it. So brightness, then darkness. It's another picture of judgment. Moving on in Isaiah 21, a pronouncement concerning Arabia. They have fled from swords. So obviously militaristic conflict has come to them as well as a pronouncement of judgment. All that to simply say that Arabia is the neighbor, or are the neighbors of Judah to their southeast. And then lastly, in 23, which I'll come back to 22 in just a second, a pronouncement concerning Tyre, which is a neighbor to the kingdom of Israel, to their northwestern border, but a people that surrounds the descendants of Abraham nonetheless. Wail, you ships of Tarshish. Sidon, you will not celebrate anymore. Ravished like a young woman, daughter of Sidon. So all this to say, these kingdoms that all pepper the map around the tiny kingdom of Judah are going to be judged. Why does this matter? Well, I would say this is the reason why. Because consider kings like Jotham and Ahaz especially. Ahaz, all frantic when Isaiah comes to him in Isaiah chapter 7, inspecting the defenses and the water supply, and worried about what's going to happen when the northern alliance of Aram and Israel come against them. And will they survive this? He's already heard of the conspiratorial plot to have him assassinated and to place the enigmatic son of a man named Tabeel on the throne, who they can control by making him their puppet king. And he's worried for his own life and, of course, for his legacy, the house of David, which seemingly cares nothing for the spiritual legacy of David, to survive beyond this. All that to simply say that he is trying to, in his mind, play three-dimensional chess, seeing the long game, seizing the opportunity that presents itself to him, which will not be lucrative in the long run, but to align himself with Assyria to save him from the threat and the onslaught of Israel and Aram, whose forces he thinks he cannot possibly survive or stand against. All that to say, Judah, if you just simply look at the back of your study Bible, at a map of ancient Israel during the time of the divided monarchy, is a tiny kingdom compared to everybody else. They are easy prey. In the terms of conventional wisdom, one might think that they would need to strengthen themselves through as many alliances as they can possibly make, to make sure that they are safe, guarded against the whims of anyone else who might come to conquer them and just assimilate them into their own land holdings, because that could be possible. But their assurances do not lie in treaties or strength of horses and armies, chariots, and all this other business. They are not to trust in treaties. They are to trust in the Lord. And that's the reason why all of these proclamations find their measure of significance. Because when we go here to what is said in Isaiah 22, that God has removed the defenses of Judah, because through the times of Ahaz, who was the father of Hezekiah, that Jerusalem suffers greatly with all of the conflict through the invasions of Israel and Aram, and oh, by the way, Philistia and Edom, all coming into the territory of Judah, and at times even ransacking Jerusalem and causing great damage to the city and perhaps the temple. Hence the reason Hezekiah has to look to repair it in his days. That Hezekiah will also suffer military conflict against Assyria, who he certainly has no ability to be able to overcome on his own strength, because now Sennacherib has taken over for the previous kings of Shalmaneser and the king before him, Tiglath-Pileser III. And Tiglath-Pileser was the king who came down and he conquered, who attacked Judah in the days of Ahaz, and Shalmaneser is the king who came and conquered the northern kingdom of Israel and carted them off into exile. All that to say that Hezekiah is scared, and he's probably the one taking these measures here of collecting water. And of course, he is making a reservoir between the walls for the water, what we would call the tunnel of Hezekiah, to prevent it from being stopped up or rediverted away from the city, to strengthen the enemy's advantage in siege warfare against them. And then, of course, tearing down a wall and all the houses on that wall to raise up a new wall in line of defense, to strengthen the defenses, to repair the breaches in the gap or the wall. And of course, these were sensible things to do. But what he says they are not doing is that they are not considering the one who made it, the one who created it long ago. That in all that we talk about with respect to Hezekiah and the wisdom he has in going before the Lord in the temple and spreading out the letter and praying and pouring himself out over this, and then asking the Lord for help. And the Lord, through Isaiah, promises they will not enter Jerusalem and that an entire army will be decimated, which comes to pass. We have no picture of Hezekiah going before the Lord before this. Now, granted, he's taking measures to try to repair the temple, to try to get the people to be faithful again. So I'm not saying Hezekiah is a bad king, but if he's the one who fits the bill here, apparently there's a measure of him acting like his father and attempting to try to take these decisive measures, shoring up their defenses, but not considering the Lord who made it, and then coming to him. And when he says he would have preferred a day of weeping, of wailing, shaven heads, wearing of sackcloth, something that even Ahab, the worst and most wicked king of Israel, did when Elijah came and pronounced the decimation of his house because of his assassinating of Naboth for his vineyard. That instead they're throwing parties. They are reeking with joy and gladness. They're butchering cattle and slaughtering sheep and goats. They're eating meat, not because they're doing this as part of burnt offerings or sin offerings or any of this other stuff. They're doing this because, again, they're having a big party. They're celebrating as if victory has already happened, or this could be the last time they're going to get to eat, because they're saying, let's eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. And because of this, they will be judged. And when Assyria comes under Sennacherib, dozens upon dozens of cities are laid siege to and destroyed before the last city, Jerusalem, is laid siege to by Sennacherib in the days of Hezekiah. So judgment will come. All that to say, God is showing them that the alliances that they would trust themselves to will not hold strength. They will all fail, because God is going to judge every one of these kingdoms. None of them will have the strength to stand. And because of that, even Assyria will not stand, nor will their challengers and ultimate conquerors, Babylon. None of these peoples are to be counted upon. The one who is standing unrivaled, unchallenged is the Lord. And because of this, Israel will come to understand this in the long run, but it will require their devastating humiliation before this lesson finally starts to sink in for them. So then, after we get past 22 and then 23, as we've looked at, we move 24 through 27, which gives us a picture here of, yet again, a broadening of this concept, because now we're looking at the cosmos. So it's not just the nations that pepper, if I'm going to make this circle Judah, all the nations that surround her and whatnot. I know these are terrible examples of nations, but I'm just trying to give you an idea that this was the purview of this. Now we're going out to the world, everybody out there. So this is finally a glimpse at what's going on with respect to how God is going to bring everybody else on the fringes of humanity and the descendants of those who spread out from Babel and begin to populate the earth by migrating to different areas. This is how God is going to incorporate them all into that. When he looks in chapter 24, we get this I'm gonna give you a little bit of a lengthy passage here, but look, the Lord is stripping the earth bare. He is making it desolate. He will twist its surface and scatter its inhabitants, people and priest alike, servant and master, female servant and mistress, buyer, seller, lender, borrower, creditor, and debtor. So in any civilized ancient society where people are not simply scratching a living off of rocks, but have some measure of a city to dwell in and established. I'm not talking to you, Siri. Go away. The advantages of using an iPad. Siri, go away. Thank you. Where they have some measure of civilization, where this kind of infrastructure exists, which is everybody in the ancient world at this time, on this side of the planet at least, then this is encompassing everybody else outside of the spectrum of what Isaiah was just preaching against, right? So it's important for us to recognize this, because as we move on, the earth will be stripped completely bare, will be totally plundered, for the Lord has spoken this message. The city of chaos. But what city is that? No city is mentioned here by name. That could be Jerusalem. That could be Babylon. That could be Damascus. That could be Nineveh of Assyria. That could be Persepolis of Persia, who nobody's talking about at this point in the Isaiah scroll, but is ultimately going to come to conquer Babylon, who conquered Assyria, or Greece, right? And who, whatever you might consider to be the capital city of the kingdom that Alexander would rule over, and so forth. But it could be any empire that is going to wind up coming on the stage after Assyria does, because we are now entering into the age of empires, culminating in Rome after that. So the city of chaos is shattered. Every house is closed to entry. In the streets, they cry for wine. All joy grows dark. Earth's rejoicing goes into exile. Only desolation remains in the city. Again, this is not a specific city. This could be any city, because all cities will fall prey to God's judgment when he comes to bring about the end of the age, in which he will rule over the cosmos, and all governments will be subject to his ultimate sovereignty, which they have always been. But this is to say that God's kingdom will be physically established in such a way that it will be visibly represented amongst the inhabitants of the earth, the very thing that Jesus was saying he was establishing in his day. Its gates has collapsed in ruins, for this is how it will be on the earth among the nations, like a harvested olive tree, which means you've shaken all the olives out, you've beat them all out, there's only a few left, like a gleaning after a great harvest. On that day, the Lord will punish the army on the heights, and then the heights, army of the heights in the heights, and the kings of the ground on the ground. So again, nobody is going to escape this. Now that's chapter 24, which moves us into chapter 25, which we read the first 5 verses way up here in the beginning. Lord, you are my God. So we are jumping into a psalm now. I will exalt you. I will praise your name. You have accomplished wondrous plans formed long ago with perfect faithfulness. You have turned the city. What city? Again, this could be any city that we are talking about, the capital or any city within a nation that has vaunted itself against the Lord in its own pride, as we have seen through the corridor 13 all the way up through 23, but reaching beyond that to massive empires that have been constructed on the ash and skull heaps of these previous kingdoms that they conquered and trampled over to forge their empires in blood and bone. So you have turned it into a pile of rocks, a fortified city into ruins. The fortress of barbarians is no longer a city, and it will never be rebuilt, meaning it will not stand against you. That's what this all means, is that even though world power is changing in the way that it looks, and we're actually going to be talking about kingdoms forging themselves into full-on empires covering massive tracts of land, yet while this is something unprecedented and is going to continue to grow bigger and crazier than anybody could have ever imagined, this is nothing to the Lord. Nothing. And he will turn it all upside down, shake it all about, bash it into pieces, and from its ashes reforge a new humanity in which it's all consolidated under his headship as one kingdom, under one king that will never pass away, as his dominion will fill the earth and will never fade. So anyway, let's move down to the rest of chapter 25, or just a touch of what's left in 25, because that is a devastating picture in 24 Beginning in 25, it's a psalm, but it's a psalm of devastation and judgment. But then we have a picture of renewal, which we would expect from Isaiah, because if he speaks of judgment, usually what's going to happen after that is in tow will come restoration and redemption. The promise is that on this mountain, meaning Zion, the Lord of armies will prepare for all peoples, all nations. So if we're talking about the cosmos, we're talking beyond just the 11 countries or the countries of North Africa, southern Greece, and the Mesopotamian River Valley, but everybody. A feast of choice meat, a feast with aged wine, prime cuts of choice meat, vintage wine. And on this mountain he will swallow up the burial shroud, the shroud over all peoples, the sheet covering all the nations. When he has swallowed up death once for all, the Lord will wipe away the tears from their very face and remove his people's disgrace from the whole earth, because he has spoken. And on that day it will be said by these peoples, not just Jerusalem or Judah or Israel for that matter. All these peoples will say, look, this is our God. We have waited for him. He has saved us. This is the Lord. We have waited for him. Let's rejoice and be glad in his salvation, because God's power will rest on this mountain. And Jesus is hinting at that. Folks, when he's got 5,000 squatted in companies of 50s and 100s, and his disciples are passing out chunks of fish and bread to them, this is a hint at this very thing, because that happens there on a mountain. And when he repeats this miracle with 4,000 people, it's the same idea. But the 4,000 is up around the Decapolis area, heavily populated by Gentiles, sparsely by Jews, signaling that while it was mostly Jewish in the 5,000, mostly Gentile in the 4,000, this picture combines as a collage of what he is doing on this mountain, which he said in John 4 is not really Jerusalem in the hard spot on a map kind of idea. It's Jerusalem everywhere, because there will come a time, and that is now for us, in which you will not worship God on this mountain where he was standing at with the woman in Samaria, or in Jerusalem, but you will worship him in spirit and truth everywhere, right? Because that kingdom has come. It's been inaugurated. It's spreading even now across the earth, because judgment has come. Redemption has followed. There is a final sweeping judgment that will destroy all wickedness and evil and renew the earth, but that renewal has already begun in us. And this leads us up to eventually what will culminate in the rest of this little section of 28 and 30, because sadly we have a lesson that goes unlearned and advice unheeded. So our last passage we read up top was chapter 30, so that's why I've drawn it out this far. 28, he says, therefore, hear the word of the Lord, you scoffers who rule this people in Jerusalem. So again, you're like, man, we're just all over the place with this judgment stuff, judgment and redemption, and the judgment and the redemption, because we just talked about how God is going to be restoring all humanity on his mountain and all that, and they're going to be having a magnificent feast. And so why now are we back to pronouncing woes on Jerusalem? Because the prism continues to alter its angle so that we can see the beautiful but fantastically devastating picture of what God is doing. For you said, we have made a covenant with death. We have made an arrangement with Sheol. With the overwhelming catastrophe, or when the overwhelming catastrophe passes through, it will not touch us, because we have made falsehood our refuge, as opposed to the Lord being our refuge, and have hidden behind treachery. This covenant of death is what is going on in the background with respect to probably Hezekiah trying to align himself with Egypt, because if we read the historical material outside of Isaiah in the books of Kings and Chronicles, we come to understand that's part of what Hezekiah does when he ultimately rebels against Assyria. That's part of what leads Assyria to come and attack. It wasn't simply because they just decided, we're all bored. We haven't conquered anybody in a while. Who's left out there? Judah. Yeah, let's go try there. It's because Ahaz, Hezekiah's father, subjected them to being vassals to the Assyrian emperor, which means they will pay heavy tribute year after year. And Hezekiah wanted to rebel against that. He wanted to restore sovereignty over the kingdom of David as a son of David, but it will not work well for him, because it will lead to this sweeping measure of judgment in which Assyria comes to collect, and they do that through force, right? And to leave a lasting message, which isn't simply smacking Judah around a little bit to remind them who's in charge, but they want to full on conquer them like they did the northern kingdom and cart them off into exile, which would have happened had they conquered Jerusalem. In all of this, Hezekiah is trying to lean on Egypt to help them. And that's part of why they are being told, look, they are like a splintered reed. You put any pressure on them and it's going to stab you through the hand. They cannot help you. They won't even be able to leave their land to come and help you. Or at least that's probably what's later said with respect to a Babylonian alliance, or I'm sorry, an alliance with them during this period of Babylonian conquest. All that to say, the Lord says, in opposition to this alliance with Egypt, I've laid a stone in Zion, a tested stone, a precious cornerstone, a sure foundation, and the one who believes will be unshakable. And I will make justice the measuring line and righteousness the mason's level. Hail will sweep away the false refuge. God is going to batter it to pieces, and water will flood your hiding place. Again, Assyria bringing judgment. Your covenant with death will be dissolved, and your agreement with Sheol will not last. When the overwhelming catastrophe passes through, you will not be spared. You will be trampled. So, in all that they have been told by Isaiah leading up to this, and what we've read in the preceding chapters, they have not come to take refuge in the Lord. It literally takes a letter sent by the Assyrian officials, commissioned by Sennacherib, saying, we're coming for you, for him to go into the temple and finally cry out to the Lord, saying, help, please help us. Then we move on to 29. Woe to you, Ariel, Ariel, the city where David camped. So Ariel is just another name for Jerusalem, but where David camped. Now, to say camped means it's kind of like a militaristic picture, because we were supposed to be thinking about the time when David came and he attacked Jerusalem, which was the city of the Jebusites, before he conquered it and made it the capital of his kingdom. He says, continue year after year, let the festivals recur, but I will oppress Ariel. And there will be mourning and crying, and she will be to me like an Ariel. And I will camp in a circle around you, as if to say that now Jerusalem has become the Jebusites. And David, pictured here as the Lord camping against the Jebusites, but God now camping in a militaristic posture against them. Because he says, I will besiege you with earth ramps, and I will set my siege towers against you. You will be brought down. So stop, be astonished. Blind yourselves and be blind. Going back to the picture that was given here in Isaiah 6, when he asks the Lord, when he is commissioned to be a prophet to these people, how long should I go and preach this message? And he says, until the cities lie uninhabited. But ultimately, he tells them, seeing, keep on not seeing, and hearing, keep on not paying attention. So blind yourselves and be blind. Don't see the truth of what I'm saying to you, and be subject to the devastation that's going to come in the process. They are drunk, but not with wine. They stagger, but not with beer, because the Lord has poured on them an overwhelming urge to sleep, and he has shut their eyes, meaning the eyes of the prophets, and he has covered their heads, meaning the seers. Because the Lord said, these people approach me with their speeches to honor me with lip service, but their hearts are far from me, and human rules direct their worship of me. Therefore, I will again confound these people with wonder after wonder. The vision of their wise will vanish, and the perception of their perceptive will be hidden. Because we understand there are more prophets than just Isaiah at work here. In our previous Isaiah lesson, I said that there were other contemporaries such as Amos, Micah, and Hosea, who are indeed true prophets of the Lord. But there are many other prophets who are probably products of the sons of the prophets from the days of Samuel and then Elijah and Elisha. And with that, of course, some of them may have corrupted their way and decided to become seekers of pleasure and comfort and recognition by Judean kings, rather than standing in the gap and saying very difficult words that could very well threaten their own health, not just their status, by being faithful to the Lord's message. But the Lord has caused them to fall into a stupor. And of course, the people of Judah and Jerusalem are always torn between who are we going to listen to, and which prophet, which one is really speaking for the Lord, and going back to the test that Moses gave in Deuteronomy for challenging the words of a prophet and so forth. And of course, which message is easier and more convenient to listen to versus the one that is more challenging and difficult and requires more of them. And this ultimately leads us up to chapter 30, where in the beginning of that chapter, there's a lot to say with respect to judgment, but we end on this rather high or more somber note. The Lord is still waiting to show you mercy, and he's rising up to show you compassion, because the Lord is a just God, and all who wait for him patiently are happy. And people will indeed live on Zion in Jerusalem. And there will come a time that they won't weep anymore, and God will show his favor to them. In fact, it will be so tender that when they simply cry out to him, he will hear their words and he will answer them. But he promises that in spite of this message of comfort and reassurance, that he indeed is going to be feeding them meager bread, small portions, and water during their oppression. So the kind of food that captives get. But during all of this, he is not going to hide from them. He is going to be with them. He is going to continue to teach them wisdom to walk in. He is going to show them as he whispers to them, this is the way, walk in it. And ultimately, it's going to purge their hearts of their idols. They'll throw them away. And it does lead to a hint of what restoration will look like in the period of the post-exilic prophets, Zechariah, Haggai, and the other religious leaders and so forth, to set up the stage for when Messiah finally does come, this shoot from the stump of Jesse, and bring in this era of restoration and redemption, and ending Exodus to begin, or ending exile to begin the final Exodus for all peoples to come to God's cosmic mountain and become part of his kingdom, his covenant family. So I hope in some ways that's helped with at least 30 chapters of Isaiah and understanding what a lot of the background is trying to suggest to us is happening, and the scenery of God's wonderful blessing as he is playing this out for not only the benefit of Abraham's people, but for all humanity, which of course was promised to become part of Abraham's family, as he is supposed to be the father of many nations. So you might wonder again, well, what does this have to do with me? It has everything to do with you, because you find yourselves written parenthetically into these words. Because when we're looking at these pictures of restoration that apply not only to Abraham's ethnic descendants, but all of his descendants that are co-heirs with Israel as part of these promises now, if they have become part of Messiah's covenant family by faith, then this is our story. So what are the things being said in Isaiah that will come about in the age of this kingdom? Many of us are taught from something of a dispensational perspective to just look at many of these words of restoration as being strictly given to the people of Israel, and they have nothing to do with the Gentile nations. And so therefore, it's easy to read them and just put them into that box and assume that this has nothing to do with me. So I really don't need to understand all of the mysticism or the enigmatic, mysterious nature of it all, because this will be given to them during their actual literal kingdom phase in which Jesus rules and reigns from Jerusalem. But friend, I don't think that that's really a biblical way of understanding Isaiah, considering what we've just discussed here briefly tonight. So I challenge you on that. I'm not saying that I'm right, because it's entirely possible I could be wrong. But there are many scholars and commentators who agree with what I'm saying, while there are, of course, scholars who agree with that dispensational perspective. But all that to say, there is much hope, and I think a much clearer picture of Isaiah in looking at it from the perspective of all humanity being redeemed and coming into this kingdom that Jesus did not say is coming, but he came to inaugurate, which is here already, and we are living amongst and as a part of. So reading that back into this and understanding that perspective, then I think will open up Isaiah to you in a bold, brave, and new. And Jesus ultimately, as these words are about you, in spite of all the brilliance that people have helped us reimagine Isaiah with in their commentative and scholarly works, yet it falls utterly short of what you can help us understand by illuminating our eyes and hearts with your wisdom. So please help us better understand and not avoid Isaiah because it's just too intimidating or daunting to read. But help us, lead us to the right resources. Help us to put together the connections with other parts of Scripture so that we can see the patterns here and understand the layout. Help us to glean and drink deeply from Isaiah and see how it permeates so much more of Scripture, especially the New Testament. We love you, Lord. We give you all praise in your name. Amen.